What does global responsibility mean to you? Perhaps it's a phrase you've heard tossed around, but have you ever stopped to really consider its implications? In our increasingly interconnected world, we are no longer isolated entities. Our actions and decisions have the potential to impact people thousands of miles away. This is where the concept of global responsibility comes into play. It's about acknowledging that we're all part of a larger global community and that we have a role to play in its well-being. One of the most profound ways this responsibility manifests is through humanitarian interventions. These are actions undertaken, often by nations or international organizations, with the objective of protecting human rights and alleviating suffering. It's about stepping in when local efforts are overwhelmed or when governments are the ones causing harm. Global responsibility is not just an abstract concept, it's a call to action. Humanitarian intervention, a term we often hear, but what does it truly entail? Well, let's break it down. Humanitarian intervention refers to the actions taken by an individual nation, a group of nations, or an international organization, such as the United Nations, with the aim of preventing or ending gross violations of human rights or widespread suffering within a country. This action can involve various measures, including diplomatic negotiations, sanctions, and in some extreme cases, military intervention. But why is such intervention necessary? Imagine a scenario where a country is undergoing a severe crisis. This could be a brutal civil war, a catastrophic natural disaster, or a rampant disease outbreak. In these situations, the national government may be unable or unwilling to protect its own citizens. When such a dire situation arises, it becomes the responsibility of the global community to step in and provide assistance. This is where humanitarian intervention comes into play. Now you might be wondering, isn't this a violation of a country's sovereignty? In normal circumstances, yes. But when it comes to humanitarian intervention, it's a bit more complex. The principle of non-intervention, which respects the sovereignty of a nation, is a cornerstone of international law. However, when a government fails to protect its citizens from mass atrocities or severe suffering, the international community may have a moral duty to intervene, despite the sovereignty issue. This delicate balance between respecting sovereignty and protecting human lives is one of the central debates surrounding humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention isn't just about saving lives, it also aims to create conditions for lasting peace and stability. After the immediate crisis is over, efforts are often directed towards rebuilding the affected areas, promoting democratic governance, and fostering economic development. So, to sum it all up, humanitarian intervention is a multifaceted and complex process, but its ultimate goal is quite simple: to protect and preserve human life and dignity. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves, about reaching out to our fellow human beings in their darkest hours. Humanitarian intervention, at its core, is a lifeline thrown to those in desperate need. Let's delve into history to better understand the role of humanitarian intervention. One chapter of history that painfully illuminates this is the Rwandan Genocide, a dark period that lasted approximately 100 days in 1994, where an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Tutsi people were brutally murdered. This horrific event was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but a meticulously planned and executed genocide, orchestrated by the Hutu-led government. The world watched in horror as news trickled out, but the international community's response was tragically less than immediate. The United Nations had peacekeeping forces in Rwanda at the time, but they were outnumbered and under-equipped to deal with the scale of the violence. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council debated whether the situation constituted a genocide, a term that would have legally obliged them to intervene. By the time they declared it a genocide, the killings were nearly over. The ethical implications of this delayed intervention are profound. Humanitarian intervention is, at its core, a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In this case, the international community was slow to acknowledge and act upon this responsibility. The aftermath of the Rwandan genocide saw a reckoning of sorts. The international community had to confront the consequences of its delayed response. The UN publicly regretted its failure to prevent the genocide, and the event prompted the organization to develop a new responsibility to protect doctrine, acknowledging that sovereignty cannot be a shield behind which states hide to commit atrocities against their own people. Yet the scars of the genocide remain, not only in Rwanda, but in the collective conscience of the world. The lessons learned have shaped subsequent humanitarian interventions, but they came at a devastating cost. The Rwandan Genocide stands as a stark reminder of the cost of inaction. It underscores the ethical implications of delayed or non-intervention, and it serves as a haunting testament to the dire consequences when the world turns a blind eye to mass atrocities. It is a reminder that our global responsibility extends beyond borders, and that we must act decisively and swiftly to prevent such horrors from recurring. Fast forward to a more recent crisis, the Syrian Civil War. This conflict, beginning in 2011, has been marked by a complex web of political, religious, and ethnic tensions, escalating into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The international community's response to the Syrian Civil War has been, to put it mildly, contentious. While there's been a general consensus that intervention is necessary, the nature, extent, and timing of that intervention have been subjects of intense debate. The United Nations, for instance, has faced criticism for its perceived lack of decisive action. Despite numerous resolutions and peace talks, the conflict has raged on, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced. The UN's response, or lack thereof, has raised questions about the effectiveness and ethical responsibility of international organizations in times of crisis. In contrast, individual countries have taken more direct action, but these interventions have not been without controversy. The United States and Russia, for example, have both intervened militarily, but their actions have often been seen as driven more by geopolitical interests than by humanitarian concerns. This raises another ethical dilemma. When does intervention become interference? Furthermore, non-state actors, such as non-governmental organizations and private corporations, have also played significant roles in the conflict. Their involvement, though often well-intentioned, has sometimes exacerbated tensions and contributed to the conflict's complexity. This highlights the ethical challenges of intervention, even when the actors involved have the best of intentions. The Syrian Civil War is a stark reminder that humanitarian intervention is not a simple matter of good versus evil. It's a complex, multifaceted issue that requires careful thought, planning, and execution. It's a reminder that even with the best of intentions, intervention can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. The Syrian Civil War has shown us that even when the world responds, the ethical path is not always clear. It's a sobering thought, and one that underscores the importance of ethical considerations in humanitarian interventions. As we move forward, it's crucial that we learn from these experiences and strive to make more informed ethical decisions in the face of future crises. So where does this leave us in terms of the ethics of humanitarian intervention? Let's delve into the ethical considerations and dilemmas surrounding humanitarian intervention. It's like traversing a tightrope walk, with every step demanding a careful balance between protecting human rights and respecting national sovereignty. On one hand, we have the principle of responsibility to protect, often abbreviated as R2P. This principle, endorsed by the United Nations in 2005, posits that if a state is unable or unwilling to protect its citizens from mass atrocities, the international community has a moral duty to step in. But on the other hand, there's the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs, a cornerstone of international law. It's an ethical dilemma, isn't it? Should we prioritize non-interference, or should we uphold the responsibility to protect? Then, there's the question of intent versus impact. Humanitarian interventions are, by definition, intended to alleviate human suffering. But the reality is that they can sometimes lead to unintended consequences, like civilian casualties or prolonged conflict. How do we reconcile the noble intent with the potential for harmful impact? Moreover, there's the matter of selectivity. Why are some crises met with international intervention, while others are not? This inconsistent response raises questions about the impartiality of humanitarian intervention. And finally, there's the issue of accountability. Who holds interveners accountable when interventions go awry? And how can we ensure that interventions are carried out with the utmost respect for human rights and international law? These are hefty considerations, and they weigh heavily in the decision-making process. They remind us that humanitarian intervention isn't just a matter of rushing in to save the day. It's a complex, ethical undertaking that requires careful thought, planning, and execution. It's about making difficult choices in the face of grave human suffering, with the goal of upholding the dignity and rights of all people. Humanitarian intervention is a complex ethical landscape, one that demands careful navigation. We've journeyed through history and dissected complex ethical issues. What have we learned? From the turbulent times of the Rwandan Genocide to the harrowing events of the Syrian Civil War, we've seen how humanitarian interventions can shape the course of nations and the lives of countless individuals. We've understood that humanitarian intervention is not merely a phrase, but a responsibility that transcends borders. It's a call to uphold human dignity, a call that demands an ethical response. The ethics of humanitarian intervention is a delicate balance. It seeks to prevent gross human rights violations, while also respecting the sovereignty of nations. It's about making hard choices in the face of overwhelming adversity and understanding that our actions, or in some cases, our inactions, can have profound implications. In our increasingly connected world, the ethics of global responsibility and humanitarian intervention are more relevant than ever. May this understanding guide us as we navigate the complexities of our global community.